The air in the first-class cabin of Atlantic Airways Flight 447 was a carefully curated fiction. It smelled of clean leather, expensive perfume, and the faint, sterile promise of recycled oxygen. It was an atmosphere designed to soothe, to insulate its occupants from the mundane realities of travel. For the man in seat 1A, it was a cage, and he was acutely aware of every gilded bar. Elias Vance sat motionless, a study in deliberate stillness. He wore faded blue jeans, a gray hoodie with a frayed cuff, and worn leather boots that had seen more miles on rugged earth than on polished airport floors. His only luggage was a simple scarred leather satchel at his feet. He was an anomaly in this world of tailored suits and silk blouses, a gray rock in a stream of glittering jewels. He did not belong, and that was precisely the point. Anonymity was a weapon, and for this mission, it was the only one he had left. His gaze, a muted shade of storm gray, swept across the cabin not as a tourist might, but as a predator assesses a new hunting ground. He catalogued the details with a precision born from a life he had tried to bury. The businessman in 2C, Julian Croft, whose bespoke suit probably cost more than the car Elias had left at the long-term parking lot. The woman in 3A with diamonds on her wrist that caught the cabin light. The young couple in the row behind, already sipping champagne, their laughter a little too loud, a little too bright. He saw them all not as people, but as variables in a complex equation he had yet to solve. For 5 years, Elias had lived as a ghost, a whisper in the quiet mountains of Colorado. He had chopped wood, fixed fences, and let the silence heal the ragged edges of his soul. But peace was a luxury he had not earned. The real ghost, the one that haunted his every waking moment and twisted his dreams into nightmares, was a man known only as the Alchemist, a phantom who traded in secrets and lies, a broker of chaos, who had sold the intelligence that led to the ambush in Istanbul, the ambush that had cost him his team, the ambush that had stolen his wife Anya. Her face swam in his memory, her laughter a phantom echo. "Come back to me, Eli." She had whispered, her hand on his cheek, the last time he saw her alive. He was coming back in his own way. This flight was the first step on a path that could only end in one of two ways, with justice for Anya or with him joining her in the dust. A coded message from an old, half-trusted contact had been cryptic but clear. The Alchemist was making a move. A key asset would be on Flight 447 carrying a package. Find the asset, get the package, and the trail to the ghost would finally open. So here he sat, the hunter disguised as prey, waiting for the game to begin. He just hadn't expected it to start with him. "Sir." The voice was sharp-edged with an impatient condescension that cut through the cabin's placid hum. He looked up. A flight attendant stood over him, her name tag reading Laura. She was immaculate, her dark hair pulled back into a severe knot, her uniform pressed to military sharpness. Her expression, however, was anything but professional. It was a mask of polite disdain, her eyes scanning his attire as if it were a personal insult. "Sir, I'm afraid you're in the wrong seat," she said, her voice loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. "This section is for our premium passengers only." The curated fiction of the cabin shattered. Heads turned. The quiet murmur of conversation faltered. Elias felt the weight of their gazes, curious, judgmental. He was the entertainment. He kept his own expression neutral, a blank canvas. Inside, a cold, familiar calm settled over him. This was a complication, an unnecessary variable. "There's no mistake," he said, his voice quiet level. He held up his boarding pass, the paper flimsy in his calloused hand. "Seat 1A. Laura barely glanced at it. Her lips thinned into a bloodless line. "That is impossible. There must be a system error." "May I see your identification?" The demand was a challenge. It was a public questioning of his right to exist in this space. He could feel the shift in the cabin's atmosphere. The businessman Croft had lowered his newspaper slightly, his dark eyes fixed on the exchange with an unnerving intensity. This was more than casual curiosity. Croft was watching him, studying him. The hairs on the back of Elias's neck prickled. He maintained his calm, a lifetime of training holding his frustration in check. A scene would compromise him. It would make him memorable, and a ghost cannot afford to be remembered. He produced his driver's license, a simple Colorado ID with the name David Peterson, one of a dozen identities he kept active. Laura took it, holding it by the edges as if it were contaminated. She scrutinized the photo, then his face, then the boarding pass. The silence stretched thick with unspoken accusation. "Sir, our records show this seat was booked for a different passenger. You will have to move to the back of the aircraft." Her tone was final. She was not asking. She was commanding. Elias felt a slow burn start in his chest. It was the injustice of it, the casual arrogance. In his old life, a flick of his wrist, a few quiet words would have ended this instantly. But he was David Peterson now, a nobody in a gray hoodie. "Your records are incorrect," he stated simply. "I booked this ticket myself. Please check your system again." He was offering her an out, a chance to retreat without losing face. She did not take it. "I don't need to check my system. It's clear there has been a mistake. Now, if you'll please gather your things." "Is there a problem here, Laura?" The new voice was deep-laced with an easy authority. Captain Evans emerged from the cockpit, a man whose presence seemed to fill the narrow aisle. He was tall, silver-haired, with a square jaw, and the confident bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime in command. He addressed Laura, but his eyes were fixed on Elias, sizing him up with a single sweeping glance. The assessment was instantaneous and dismissive. The hoodie, the jeans, the worn boots. He saw a problem, not a passenger. "This gentleman is refusing to move from a first-class seat," Captain Laura reported, her voice taking on a note of vindicated grievance. "He appears to be under the impression that he belongs here." The condescension was a physical thing, a sour taste in the air. Captain Evans stepped forward, positioning himself squarely in front of Elias's seat, a human wall. "Son, you're holding up our departure." The captain said, his voice a low rumble. He did not ask for the boarding pass. He did not ask for identification. He had already reached his verdict. "I need you to move to your real seat in coach. Now. We don't need any trouble." Elias looked from the captain's implacable face to Laura's smug expression. He saw Julian Croft in his peripheral vision, still watching, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips. This was no longer a simple mistake. It felt orchestrated. The confrontation was too aggressive, the judgment too swift. They weren't just trying to move a passenger. They were trying to provoke him. Why? The question sharpened his senses. He had been meticulous. His tracks were covered. The David Peterson identity was clean. No one should have known he was on this flight. Was this a test, a random act of prejudice? Or had the alchemist somehow anticipated him? He had to end this, but he couldn't back down. Moving to coach would mean losing his strategic vantage point. It would mean failing before he even began. The memory of Anya's smile, tinged with the smoke and fire of Istanbul, flashed in his mind. He would not fail. He met Captain Evans's gaze directly. The storm in his own eyes was cold-controlled. He let the silence hang for a beat, forcing the captain to truly look at him, to see past the clothes to the man beneath. "My name is David Peterson," Elias said, his voice dropping slightly, losing its placid tone and taking on a hard metallic edge. "I am not your son, and I am in the seat that I paid for. Seat 1A. My ticket is valid. My documentation is in order. You are holding up this flight. Captain, not me." He spoke with an authority that did not belong to a man in a faded hoodie. It was the voice of a man accustomed to giving orders, of a man who understood leverage and command. It caught both Laura and the captain off guard. They had expected him to shrink, to apologize, to obey. They did not expect him to push back with such unwavering certainty. The captain's eyes narrowed. For a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face before it was replaced by hardened resolve. "That's enough. I'm calling ground security." "And what will you tell them?" Elias countered, his voice dangerously soft. "That a paying passenger in his assigned seat refused to be illegally removed from the aircraft by your crew. That you delayed an international flight based on the appearance of his clothes." He leaned forward slightly. "Do you really want to have that conversation?" Captain Evans. He had used the captain's name. A small detail, but a significant one. It was a signal that he was paying attention, that he was not some disoriented passenger to be bullied. The cabin was dead silent. Even the couple with the champagne had stopped laughing. Julian Croft was no longer pretending to read his paper. He was watching the scene unfold with the rapt attention of a spectator at a gladiatorial match. And Elias knew with a sudden chilling certainty that this was exactly what Croft wanted to see. He wanted to see how Elias would react under pressure. Laura, sensing the captain's hesitation, stepped in. "He's being disruptive and aggressive, Captain." "I have not raised my voice," Elias said, his gaze still locked on Evans. "I have not moved from my seat. I have simply stated the facts. The only aggression here has come from your crew." A stalemate. The captain was trapped between his own ego and the undeniable logic of Elias's words. Removing him now would create a firestorm of paperwork and a potential lawsuit. Letting him stay would be a public defeat. From his seat, Julian Croft cleared his throat. The sound was subtle, but it broke the tension. Perhaps Croft said, his voice smooth as polished marble. The flight attendant could simply use her tablet to scan the gentleman's boarding pass. Surely the electronic system can resolve this simple misunderstanding, and we can all be on our way. It was a perfectly reasonable suggestion delivered in a helpful tone. But Elias saw it for what it was, a move on a chessboard. Croft was de-escalating the situation, but why had Elias passed the test? Or was this a way to keep him here in this seat under Croft's watchful eye? Captain Evans shot Croft an irritated glance, but the logic was inescapable. The entire cabin was watching, waiting. With a tight, angry nod, he gestured at Laura. "Do it. Let's get this over with." Laura's fingers stabbed at her handheld device, her movements jerky with frustration. She brought the scanner to Elias's boarding pass, which he held out with a steady hand. The device beeped. She stared at the screen, her face paling slightly. She tapped it again as if disbelieving the result. The screen glowed with the undeniable truth. Passenger D. Peterson. Seat 1A. Status confirmed. She looked up, her mouth opening and closing silently. All her certainty, her smug superiority had evaporated, leaving behind a raw, naked shock. "Well," the captain demanded. She swallowed hard. It's confirmed, Captain. Seat 1A. Captain Evans stared at Elias, his expression unreadable. He had been publicly proven wrong. Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode back into the cockpit, the door clicking shut behind him with a sharp finality. Laura stood frozen for a moment longer, the focus of dozens of pairs of eyes. Humiliation radiated from her in waves. She gave Elias a look of pure venom before turning and disappearing toward the galley. The immediate crisis was over. A quiet buzz of conversation resumed as passengers processed what they had just witnessed. The show had ended. Elias leaned his head back against the soft leather, the adrenaline slowly receding, leaving a cold watchfulness in its wake. He had won the battle, but may have compromised the war. He was no longer invisible. Across the aisle, he met Julian Croft's gaze. The businessman raised his glass of water in a small, almost imperceptible salute. The smirk was gone, replaced by an expression of calculated respect. It was a silent, chilling acknowledgement. The game had begun, and they were both players. The aircraft leveled off at 37,000 feet, a silver dart in an endless ocean of blue. Below the world was a patchwork of green and brown, distant and irrelevant. Up here in the pressurized, climate-controlled tube, there was only the present. A no-man's land of recycled air and the muffled, hypnotic drone of the engines. For Elias, this suspension between earth and sky was a fitting purgatory. He was a man between lives, between a past he couldn't forget and a future he couldn't yet see. The tension from the initial confrontation had not vanished. Instead, it had mutated, dissolving from a single sharp point of conflict into a pervasive atmospheric miasma of suspicion. The other passengers occasionally cast furtive glances his way, their whispers masked by the engine's roar. He was no longer just a man in the wrong seat. He was a story, a brief and curious drama to pass the time. He let them look. Their shallow curiosity made them predictable, and predictable people were safe. It was the unpredictable ones he had to worry about. His focus was on the crew. He sat perfectly still. His posture relaxed, but his senses were fully engaged, sifting through the data stream of the cabin. He tracked the flight attendants' movements, their patterns of speech, the subtle tells in their body language. It was a skill honed in the crowded markets of Damascus and the sterile boardrooms of Geneva, the ability to find the signal in the noise. Laura, the flight attendant who had challenged him, was a master of avoidance. She served passengers on the opposite side of the aisle with a brittle, overbright smile, her movements precise and stiff. But when her route forced her past his seat, her smile vanished. Her posture tightened, and her gaze was fixed resolutely forward. It was more than resentment. It was a carefully controlled fear. She was afraid of him. Not because he had bested her, but because his presence had disrupted something far more important than her sense of superiority. Then he saw it. Laura was speaking with another flight attendant, a tall, stern-faced man named Ben near the forward galley. To a casual observer, it was a routine exchange. But Elias wasn't a casual observer. As they spoke, Laura gestured with her right hand, her fingers brushing her lapel. Ben's eyes flickered down for a fraction of a second, and then he gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The gesture was fleeting, almost non-existent, but Elias saw it. A quick, deliberate tap of the forefinger on the collarbone. A cold wave washed over him, sharp and clarifying. It was a signal from his old world, a covert sign used by his former agency to indicate a compromised situation. It had a specific meaning. The target is aware. Proceed with caution. The confrontation hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been simple prejudice. It had been a probe, a test. They wanted to see if he was just an ordinary man. His calm, unyielding response had been the wrong answer. He had flagged himself. They knew someone was on this plane, and he had just nominated himself as the prime candidate. Julian Croft, Laura Ben, and Captain Evans, they were all connected. This was a nest of vipers, and he was locked inside with them. Captain Evans's voice came over the intercom announcing their cruising altitude and estimated flight time to Chicago. The voice was smooth, professional, the perfect pilot's baritone. But Elias listened past the words. He listened to the rhythm, the cadence, the minute spaces between the syllables. And he heard it, a faint, almost sub-audible tremor. The pacing was just a fraction too quick. It was the sound of a man speaking under extreme duress, a man reading a script while a gun was pressed to his back. The low drone of the CFM engines seemed to deepen, vibrating not just through the fuselage, but through his very bones. It was a sound he associated with transit, with movement, with the long, lonely hours before a mission. It pulled him back, dragging him through time to another flight, another city, Istanbul. The air was thick with the scent of roasted chestnuts, diesel exhaust, and the sea. Anya was beside him, not in person, but a voice in his ear, a calm, steady presence on the comms link. She was his overwatch, his guardian angel, tucked away in a safe house 3 miles away, her fingers flying across a keyboard. Seeing the digital world, he could not. Grid is clear, Eli. She said, her voice a warm anchor in the chaotic symphony of the Grand Bazaar. The package is moving toward the north entrance. You have 2 minutes. He moved through the crowd, a ghost in the river of humanity. The mission was simple: intercept a courier, retrieve a data chip, and melt away. They had done it 100 times before. But something felt wrong. The air was too still, the patterns of the crowd subtly disrupted. He could feel it, a hunter's instinct screaming that the trap had already been sprung. Anya, I don't like this, he whispered into his collar mic. Stay focused, she replied, though he could hear the tension in her voice now too. I'm running a deep scan. Everything looks... Wait a minute. There's a ghost signature on the network, scrambled, heavily encrypted. I've never seen anything like it. The Alchemist. Even then, they didn't know the name, only the legend. A master manipulator of information, someone who could break any code, infiltrate any system, and sell the secrets to the highest bidder. Get out, Eli. It's a setup, get out now. Anya's voice was sharp with panic. But it was too late. The world exploded. The pushcart of spices to his left, the rug merchant stall to his right, they detonated in a synchronized, devastating blast. The last thing he heard from her was a sharp gasp and the shattering of glass. When he came to, buried under debris, his body broken but his will intact, the world was fire and screaming. He fought his way out, back to the safe house, praying, bargaining with a god he didn't believe in. He found her at her console amidst the wreckage. She was gone, but her hand was still on the keyboard. In the final seconds of her life, as the enemy stormed their position, she had managed to type one word onto the screen, a final message, a final clue from beyond the grave. Sisyphus. It was the only lead he had. The name of the operation, the Alchemist, had sold out. For 5 years he had chased that name, that ghost, through the dark corners of the world, letting it consume him until nothing else was left. Quite the performance earlier. The voice pulled Elias from the fire and smoke of his memory back to the sterile calm of the cabin. He blinked, the image of Anya's face receding like a phantom tide. He turned to his right. The man in seat 1B was looking at him, his expression one of mild academic curiosity. He was in his late 60s with a neatly trimmed white beard, kind, intelligent eyes, magnified by thick spectacles, and a rumpled tweed jacket that had seen better decades. A worn, leather-bound book rested in his lap. He looked like a university professor on his way to a conference. His name tag, which Elias had clocked during boarding, read Dr. Elias Thorne. "It's a sad state of affairs," the man continued, his voice a gentle, cultured rasp, "when a man's worth is judged by his attire." Elias's internal shield snapped into place. Was this an innocent overture from a kindly old man, or was this another probe more subtle than Laura's, but a probe nonetheless? He offered a non-committal response. People see what they expect to see. "Indeed," Aris said, turning a page of his book. The title on the spine was in classical Greek. "It reminds me of the intelligence networks of the Byzantine Empire. The best agents were never the imposing Praetorian guards. They were the scribes, the merchants, the beggars, the men who could make themselves invisible in plain sight." The words hung in the air between them. Intelligence networks, agents, invisible. This was no accident. The harmless history professor was speaking his language. Elias felt a surge of adrenaline but kept his expression placid. He had to play the game to feel out this new, unexpected piece on the board. "History is a valuable teacher," Elias said, his voice neutral, full of lessons for those who care to look. Dr. Thorne smiled faintly, a barely there crinkling around his eyes. "More than lessons, my dear boy. It offers patterns. A Roman historian named Polybius, a great student of espionage, once wrote that the most critical moments are decided not by clashing armies, but by a single piece of information passing through the right or wrong hands at the right time." He tapped the cover of his book. "Knowledge you see is the only true currency." Every word was a carefully chosen breadcrumb. Aris was either a friend and enemy, or a third party with his own agenda. Elias had to know which. The conversation was a delicate dance of subtext, a duel fought with allegories and allusions. Before Elias could formulate a response, the flight attendant call button from the row across the aisle chimed. Laura appeared instantly, her movements swift and silent. She ignored Elias completely, her focus entirely on Dr. Thorne. Her professional smile was back, but it was a brittle, painted-on thing. "Dr. Thorne," she said, her voice a low, deferential murmur that was completely at odds with the way she had spoken to Elias. "Mr. Croft is ready to see you now." Elias's blood ran cold. Aris met his gaze, and for a fleeting moment the professor's kindly mask slipped. Elias saw a flicker of something else in his eyes, a keen, calculating intelligence, and perhaps a silent warning. Then it was gone. The old man dog-eared his page with a deliberate slowness, closed the ancient book, and placed it on his seat. "Duty calls," Aris said softly, his voice meant for Elias alone. He pushed himself up from his seat with a slight groan, leaning on a handsome wooden cane Elias hadn't noticed before. Elias watched as Dr. Elias Thorne, the unassuming historian, made his way down the aisle and stopped at seat 2C. He watched as the old man leaned down and began to speak in low tones to Julian Croft, the impeccably dressed businessman with the predatory eyes. The pieces on the board had just shifted in a way he could never have predicted. The kindly old man was not a random passenger. He was connected to Croft, which meant he was connected to the crew and to the entire operation. Was he the asset, the courier, or something else entirely? The cabin felt smaller, the walls closing in. He was surrounded. The flight attendant who had tested him, the pilot who was clearly compromised, the businessman who was observing him, and now the enigmatic historian who had been sitting beside him all along, probing him with historical anecdotes. He was not the hunter here. He had walked into the hunting ground of another. For the next hour, a fragile and deceptive peace settled over the first-class cabin. Dr. Elias Thorne had returned to his seat, offering Elias a polite, unreadable nod before reopening his Greek history book. Julian Croft had requested another sparkling water and resumed his study of the financial markets on a sleek, wafer-thin tablet. The flight attendants glided through the cabin, their movements a seamless ballet of practiced service. To the untrained eye, the brief drama of the seating dispute had faded, leaving only the quiet hum of a routine flight. Elias knew better. He saw the truth in the spaces between the actions. He saw it in the way Elias Thorne's eyes, while seemingly on his book, were angled just enough to catch Elias's reflection in the dark glass of the window. He saw it in the rigid set of Croft's shoulders, a posture not of relaxation, but of coiled, waiting tension. And he saw it most clearly in Laura. She performed her duties with flawless precision, but her mask of professional calm was cracking at the edges. A slight tremor in her hand as she poured a drink, a gaze that lingered a fraction of a second too long on the cockpit door. She was a soldier awaiting orders, and her nervous energy charged the air around her. Elias was trapped in a web, and every player had taken their position. He was the fly, and they were the spiders waiting for him to make a move. The problem was, they held all the cards. They had control of the aircraft, a coordinated team, and the element of surprise. He was alone, armed with nothing but his wits and the ghosts of his past. The data chip the package his contact had mentioned was the key. It had to be. It was the reason for this elaborate charade. He felt its presence on the plane like a radioactive isotope, unseen but potent. But where was it? Who was the courier? Was it Croft, the obvious choice? Or Eris, the subtle one? Or was it someone else entirely, a passenger he hadn't yet identified? He needed to disrupt their control. He needed to force their hand to create an opportunity out of thin air. He needed chaos. As if summoned by his thoughts, the universe complied. It began without warning. A sudden stomach-lurching drop that seemed to pull the floor out from under them. The gentle hum of the engines escalated into a strained roar. The elegant crystal glasses on a nearby tray table rattled violently, and a half-full flute of champagne toppled over its contents, splashing across a passenger's silk shirt. A collective gasp swept through the cabin. The intercom crackled to life, but it was the co-pilot's voice, younger and less steady than the captain's. "Folks, apologies for that. We've hit some unexpected clear air turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts immediately. Flight attendants, secure the cabin." The words were barely out of his mouth when the plane was slammed by a second, more violent blow, this one from the side. It was a brutal physical impact, as if the aircraft had been struck by a giant invisible fist. The fuselage groaned in protest. A scream tore through the cabin, sharp and terrified. Overhead bins popped open, spilling bags and coats into the aisle. The world became a maelstrom of noise, motion, and rising panic. For most passengers it was terror. For Elias it was a gift. Through the chaos, his mind became an oasis of absolute clarity. His senses, already on high alert, sharpened to a razor's edge. He saw everything. He saw the fear in the faces of the innocent passengers, their hands gripping armrests, their knuckles white. He saw Laura and the other attendants moving through the lurching cabin, their training battling against the primal urge to take cover. And he saw Julian Croft. While others were thrown about, Croft remained perfectly centered in his seat, his body moving with the violent motion of the plane, not against it. He was an island of unnatural calm in the storm. And as Laura passed his seat, her own movements clumsy and desperate, as she tried to secure a rattling service cart, Croft made his move. It was a masterpiece of misdirection. His arm shot out seemingly to brace himself against the seat in front of him. But in that same motion, as Laura was thrown off balance toward him, his hand met hers. It was for less than a second, a fleeting touch masked by the violent bucking of the aircraft. But Elias saw it. Something small and dark passed from Croft's hand to hers. A single disguised object. It looked like a cufflink, a small piece of masculine jewelry. But Elias knew what it was. A dead drop. Simple, classic, and executed with the brutal efficiency of a professional. That was the package. The data chip. Laura's fingers closed around it, her face a pale mask of concentration. She had the prize. The objective of this entire flight was now in her possession. Elias knew he had only one chance. One window of opportunity created by the storm. He had to get that chip, or at least its contents. If it left the plane, his trail to the alchemist would go cold for good, and Anya's sacrifice would be for nothing. He formulated a plan in the space of a heartbeat. It was reckless, dangerous, and had a dozen ways it could go wrong. But it was the only play he had. He waited, his body tensed, timing his move to the rhythm of the chaos. The plane shuddered again, a long, grinding vibration that rattled his teeth. This was it. He unbuckled his seatbelt. With the next violent lurch to starboard, he let himself be thrown from his seat. He didn't fight it. He used the momentum, turning a fall into a controlled, stumbling trajectory down the narrow aisle. "Whoa!" he yelled, playing the part of a startled passenger who had been caught out of his seat. His target was the forward galley. Laura was there, her back to the cabin, her hands braced against a counter as she desperately tried to secure the latches on the service cart. The chip was in her right hand, her fingers clenched into a tight fist. In the palm of his own right hand, Elias concealed a small, flat, metallic object. It looked and felt like an old Zippo lighter, its surface worn smooth with use. It was anything but. It was a high-frequency data skimmer, a ghost from his past life, capable of copying the entire contents of a standard data chip in less than a second through proximity alone. He stumbled toward her, a puppet in the hands of the turbulent sky. "Sorry. Can't keep my feet," he shouted over the roar. He collided with her, his larger frame shielding their contact from the few passengers who might have been watching. It was a jarring impact. His left hand shot out and grabbed her shoulder as if to steady them both. His right hand, the one holding the skimmer, came down over her clenched fist, pressing against her knuckles. "Steady there," he said, his voice a grunt of exertion. He pressed the activation stud on the side of the skimmer with his thumb. For 0.7 seconds, an imperceptible high-frequency field emanated from the device, passing through her skin and bone and penetrating the chip she held. It located the data core, unlocked the encryption, a simple commercial-grade cipher he could bypass with ease, and copied every single byte of information. A tiny, silent vibration against his palm, a haptic whisper only he could feel, confirmed the transfer was complete. The entire exchange from collision to completion had taken less time than a single panicked breath. He pulled back immediately, releasing her. "My apologies," he said, his voice still loud, projecting the role of the clumsy, frightened passenger. "That jolt was a nasty one. You all right?" He began to turn to make his way back to his seat. His part in the play finished, but he made the mistake of looking at her face, and what he saw there stopped his heart. The initial shock and annoyance of the collision was already gone. It had been replaced by a flicker of confusion. Her brow furrowed. She knew instinctively that the impact had felt wrong. It was too controlled, his grip too specific. Her eyes darted down to her own clenched fist, then back up to his face. And then he saw the moment of dawning, horrifying realization. She was not just a flight attendant. Her training went deeper than serving drinks and demonstrating safety procedures. She was an operative, and she recognized the feel of a professional move. She had just been compromised. Her gaze, which had previously held contempt and then fear, was now filled with something far more dangerous: certainty. The turbulence, as if its work was done, began to subside. The violent jolts softened into a series of manageable bumps. The groaning of the airframe quieted, returning to its normal drone. The panic in the cabin began to recede, replaced by nervous laughter and shaky sighs of relief. The chaos was over. But for Elias, the true danger had just begun. He gave her a final brief nod, the apologetic passenger to the last, and made his way back to his seat, his movements steady despite the still rocking plane. He sat down and buckled his belt, his hands resting on his lap. The skimmer in his palm felt like a branding iron. He did not look back at her, but he could feel her eyes on him, a physical weight on his back. The air crackled between them, thick with unspoken knowledge. The subtext and suspicion were gone, burned away in a 2-second collision. The pretense was over. He had the data, and they knew exactly who he was. The cabin settled into a new, more dangerous equilibrium. The turbulence had passed, leaving behind a residue of frayed nerves and the smell of spilled coffee. An attendant was quietly cleaning the champagne from the silk shirt, her apologies a soft murmur in the otherwise steady drone of the engines. For Elias, however, the storm had just begun. He sat in his seat, a statue of placid calm, but inside his mind was a whirlwind. He was exposed. The careful anonymity he had cultivated for 5 years had been stripped away in a 2-second collision in the aisle of an airplane. He could feel their collective gaze on him, a palpable pressure. Laura Croft, heiress, a triangle of predators, and he was the unwelcome guest in their hunting ground. Croft no longer bothered with the pretense of his newspaper. He was watching Elias openly now, his expression a mixture of clinical assessment and predatory interest. Aris had his book open on his lap, but his eyes were closed as if listening to a piece of music only he could hear. It was a pose of deep thought, but Elias knew it was a ruse. The old man was listening to the rhythm of the cabin, waiting for Elias's next move. And Laura. She was the most dangerous of all because she was the one he had directly compromised. Her humiliation had been replaced by a cold, focused fury. She stood near the galley, ostensibly organizing supplies, but her posture was coiled and tense. She was a weapon waiting to be aimed. The skimmer in his pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. It held the answers he had sought for half a decade, the key to unraveling the alchemist's web and avenging Anya. But it was useless to him here. He couldn't risk accessing it in his seat, not with Croft and Eris watching his every move. He needed privacy, a secure location where he could work even for a few minutes. On a commercial airliner, there was only one such place: the lavatory. It was an obvious move, and they would be expecting it. They might even have a trap prepared, but it was his only option. He had to make it look natural to give them no immediate cause to intercept him. He waited, letting the minutes tick by. 15 of them. He allowed his posture to slump slightly, his breathing to become deeper. He closed his eyes, then opened them again with a wince, bringing a hand to his temple. He was laying the groundwork, building the character of a man shaken by the turbulence, a man struggling with motion sickness. It was a common enough ailment. Finally, he pushed himself to his feet, a hand pressed to his stomach in a gesture of discomfort. He swayed slightly, catching himself on the seat back. He saw Laura's eyes narrow, her body tense. He ignored her, his own gaze fixed on the glowing, vacant sign of the forward lavatory. He took a shuffling step into the aisle, his movements sluggish and weak. He could feel their focus. A silent question hung in the air. Was it real? Or was it a trick? He didn't look at them as he passed. He kept his eyes down his face, a mask of queasy misery. Each step was a gamble. He was a lone soldier walking across a minefield, knowing that any step could be his last. He reached the lavatory door without being challenged. They were letting him go. That more than anything confirmed his fears. They were letting him walk into the box. They wanted him contained. He pushed the door open, stepped inside, and slid the lock into place. The click of the bolt sounded unnaturally loud, a definitive sound that separated him from the world outside, sealing him in. The space was tiny, sterile, and claustrophobic. The hum of the ventilation was a poor mask for the roar of the engines just outside the thin wall. He took a moment, bracing his hands on the small counter, and looked at his own reflection in the mirror. The face that stared back was a stranger's David Peterson, a man with tired eyes and a life of quiet desperation. But beneath that, for the first time in a long time, the ghost was stirring. The instincts of Elias Vance were taking over. He worked quickly, his movements economical and precise. From his worn satchel, he retrieved a smartphone. It was a nondescript older model, but its casing was a custom-built Faraday cage, and its internal components had been stripped, hardened, and rebuilt by his own hands. It had no cellular or Wi-Fi capabilities. It was a closed system, an electronic lockbox that was for all intents and purposes invisible. He pulled the skimmer from his pocket and connected it to the phone with a micro USB cable. The skimmer's small memory bank immediately dumped its contents. On the phone's screen, a single massive file appeared, its name, a meaningless string of alphanumeric characters. It was locked behind a brutal layer of encryption. This was the alchemist's signature. Not just to protect the data, but to issue a challenge, a display of intellectual superiority. Elias felt a cold anger mixed with a grudging respect. He initiated his own custom decryption software. This wasn't about brute force. It was about logic, about understanding the mind of the architect. The alchemist was brilliant, but he was also arrogant. His arrogance was the key. Elias closed his eyes, picturing Anya's face, her fingers dancing across a keyboard as she explained her philosophy of code breaking. Every encryption tells a story, Eli. You just have to find the narrator. The alchemist's story was one of myths and legends, of grand theatrical gestures. He wouldn't use a random key. The key would be thematically linked to the operation. And the only name Elias had for this operation, the word Anya had died to give him, was Sisyphus. He typed the 9 letters into the decryption key field. Sisyphus. For a moment, nothing happened. The encrypted file remained a digital brick wall. He had been so certain. Then he remembered Anya's other lesson. Arrogant men love irony. Sisyphus was condemned to push a boulder up a hill for eternity. The goal was the process, not the destination. The key wouldn't be the name. It would be the action. He deleted the name and typed a new phrase, the eternal push. He hit enter. The encryption shattered like glass. Files cascaded across the screen, unfolding into a labyrinth of folders and subfolders. He ignored the chaff, the layers of decoy information, his trained eye scanning for the core data. And then he found it. His breath caught in his chest. This was infinitely bigger than he had imagined. It wasn't just a sale of intelligence. It was a master plan for global chaos. The first files were a dizzying network of offshore accounts, cryptocurrency wallets, and shell corporations stretching from the Cayman Islands to Macau. Billions of dollars were being moved, positioned like chess pieces on a global board. But it wasn't a plan for theft. It was a plan for a leveraged buyout of catastrophe. Then he opened the core file labeled Project Tartarus. His blood ran cold. It was a detailed blueprint for a multi-pronged cyber attack. The target was not a corporation or a government agency. It was the central clearinghouse server of the World Bank in Washington, D.C., the digital heart of the global financial system. The attack was designed to be undetectable, at first a virus that would corrupt transaction data at the lowest level, turning single-digit transfers into multi-million-dollar errors, erasing debts, fabricating assets. It would not steal money. It would destroy the very concept of its value. By the time the system's integrity was questioned, it would be too late. The world's financial ledgers would be rendered meaningless, triggering a panic and a market collapse that would make 1929 look like a minor correction. The alchemist would be positioned to profit from the fall, shorting markets, buying up devalued assets for pennies on the dollar. He wasn't just a broker. He was a financial terrorist on a scale the world had never seen. The final piece of the puzzle was a timeline. The attack was set to initiate in less than 72 hours. And this Flight 447, was the trigger. A file encrypted with a simple time lock contained a single message. The package is the final authorization key. Physical delivery confirms initiation. The alchemist is waiting. Croft wasn't just an asset. He was the herald of the apocalypse. A profound sense of urgency, cold and sharp, pierced through the shock. This was no longer about his personal quest for vengeance. The fate of the global economy was locked in this tiny room with him 37,000 feet in the air. He worked frantically, copying the essential files onto his phone's hardened memory, then wiped the skimmer clean, leaving not a single digital fingerprint behind. He disassembled the skimmer, dropping its tiny components into the toilet and flushing them away into the void. He pocketed his phone, the weight of the data it held pressing down on him. He took a deep, steadying breath, his reflection in the mirror, a pale, grim stranger. He smoothed his hoodie, composed his face back into the mask of David Peterson, and slid the lock open. He stepped out into the aisle and froze. They were waiting for him. Captain Evans stood directly in his path, his arms crossed over his chest. His amiable pilot's facade had vanished, leaving a face of cold, hard granite. Flanking him, blocking all avenues of escape, were Ben and another flight attendant, a hulking man with a shaved head and the dead eyes of a predator. Their posture was casual, but it was the casualness of wolves circling their prey. "Mr. Peterson," Captain Evans said. His voice was a low, menacing purr, stripped of all its earlier warmth. "I'm glad you're feeling better. We have some security concerns we need to discuss. I'll have to ask you to come with us to the cockpit to answer a few questions." The lie was so blatant it was insulting. The cockpit was a steel-reinforced soundproof box. It was a place where things could be done without witnesses. It was an execution chamber. This was the trap he knew they had been preparing. Elias's mind became a calculator, processing variables at lightning speed. 3 hostiles, all larger than him. A narrow, confined space. Passengers seated just feet away, oblivious. The odds were suicidal. He let a look of weary confusion wash over his face. "The cockpit captain, I don't understand. Can't we just talk here?" Ben shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a subtle, predatory movement. His hand twitched as if eager to reach out and grab him. "That wasn't a request," he said, his voice a low growl. The standoff was absolute. The air in the narrow aisle grew thick, heavy with the promise of violence. A woman in a nearby seat looked up from her magazine, her brow furrowing with concern. Elias met the captain's cold gaze. He knew with absolute certainty that if he took a single step toward that cockpit door, he would never be seen again. The mission, Anya's justice, the fate of the world's economy, it would all end in that tiny soundproof room. He had to make his stand here, now. "No," Elias said, his voice quiet but as unyielding as stone. "I don't think I will." The word "no" hung in the narrow aisle like a physical barrier. It was a quiet word, but it was absolute, a declaration of defiance that shifted the very atmosphere of the aircraft. For a long moment, nobody moved. It was a tableau of imminent violence, Elias poised and ready, his body a study in deceptive relaxation. Captain Evans, his face a thunderous mask of fury. and the two flight attendants, Ben and Marco, slowly flexing their hands, their knuckles cracking in the silence. Captain Evans's lips curled into a sneer. The last vestige of civility was gone. "I see," he said softly. "You've decided to make this difficult." He gave a short, sharp nod, a signal so minute it would have been invisible to anyone not looking for it. It was all the trigger his men needed. They moved in perfect sync, a practiced and brutal choreography designed for close quarters. Marco, the hulking bald man, lunged from the left, his hands reaching for Elias's head and shoulders, aiming to slam him back into the lavatory. Ben came from the right, his body low, driving forward to tackle Elias at the waist, to take his legs out from under him. It was a classic pincer movement designed to overwhelm and neutralize in seconds. They were not trying to restrain a passenger. They were trying to break a target. But they were moving against a ghost. In the split second they lunged, Elias was already in motion. He didn't retreat. He exploded forward into the space between them, the last place they expected him to be. But the space was too tight, their mass too great. He knew he couldn't take them both head-on. He could disable one, but the other would have him. He was trapped. And then the impossible happened. From seat 1B, Dr. Eris Thorne, the frail elderly historian, moved with a speed that defied his age. With a weary sigh, as if deeply inconvenienced, he stretched his legs out into the aisle. His handsome wooden cane, which had been resting against his seat, swung out in a low, precise arc. The heavy curved handle, carved from polished oak, hooked perfectly around Marco's advancing ankle. "Oh my heavens," Eris declared, his voice a theatrical quaver of elderly alarm. "A cramp. I am so terribly sorry, young man. How clumsy of me." Marco had all his weight and momentum driving him forward. The sudden, unexpected obstacle was like hitting a tripwire. He went down, and he went down hard. His huge body crashed sideways, his head cracking against the armrest of an empty seat, before he tumbled into a serving cart that had been left in the aisle. The cart overturned with a deafening clatter of metal trays, plastic cups, and tiny liquor bottles, which skittered across the floor like scattered glass marbles. The sudden, violent noise was a shockwave that broke the spell of the standoff. Passengers who had been watching with a mixture of confusion and trepidation gasped. A woman screamed. The distraction was a godsend. It was a lifetime in the world of close-quarters combat. Ben, his focus momentarily broken as he glanced toward the sound of his partner crashing, turned his head just a few fatal inches. It was all the invitation Elias needed. Elias pivoted on the ball of his left foot, his body moving with a fluid, terrifying grace that was utterly alien to the persona of David Peterson. He didn't throw a punch. Punches were crude, messy. He used the tools of a surgeon. His right elbow, hardened by years of practice, struck Ben on the side of the neck, a pinpoint kinetic strike directly on the vagus nerve cluster. There was no sound, no grunt of pain. Ben's eyes simply rolled back in his head, his nervous system short-circuited. His body went limp, all formidable power gone in an instant, and he collapsed to the floor in a heap unconscious before he even realized he'd been hit. The entire sequence from Eris's intervention to Ben's silent fall had taken less than 2 seconds. Captain Evans stared, his mouth agape, his mind unable to process the speed with which his plan had disintegrated. His two enforcers were down, and the quiet man in the hoodie was now standing before him, his gray eyes as cold and empty as a winter sky. Panic flashed across the captain's face. He fumbled inside his perfectly tailored jacket, his hand searching for something. A weapon. A radio to call for backup from the cockpit. Elias closed the distance. He grabbed the captain's wrist, his fingers digging into the pressure points with excruciating force, sending a jolt of pure agony up Evans's arm. He twisted, leveraging the joint, and slammed the captain's hand hard against the bulkhead. A small black two-way radio fell from the captain's numb fingers and clattered onto the floor. Elias kicked it under a seat. He spun the captain around, wrenching his arm up behind his back in a brutal control hold, using Evans's body as a human shield. The cabin had erupted. The contained tension had exploded into widespread panic. People were shouting, screaming, fumbling for their phones. And then a new voice cut through the chaos, high and sharp, and amplified by youthful indignation. "I'm live streaming. Oh my God, I'm live." In the first row of the economy section, a young woman with neon pink hair and a laptop covered in hacker stickers was standing on her seat, her phone held high. This was Maya. She had seen everything, her sharp programmer's mind processing the injustice of the situation from the very beginning. "The crew on this flight is attacking a passenger," she yelled, her voice a clarion call of digital age rebellion. "Atlantic Airways. Flight 447. The captain is assaulting someone. I'm live. The whole world is watching this. Her cry was a spark in a tinderbox. All around the cabin, other phones were raised, their small red recording lights blinking into existence like a sudden constellation of angry stars. The situation was no longer a contained incident. It was a viral event broadcasting in real time to the entire world. Elias knew this was his moment. He had to seize control of the narrative to turn the chaos from a liability into a weapon. He tightened his grip on the captain, causing the man to grunt in pain. He raised his voice, pitching it to cut through the noise, infusing it with an authority that commanded attention. This was not the voice of David Peterson. This was the command voice of Elias Vance, a voice that had rallied besieged soldiers and calmed terrified civilians. Everyone be quiet and listen to me. The sheer force of the command silenced the cabin. The screaming subsided into whimpers, the shouting into fearful murmurs. All eyes were on him. My name is Elias Vance, he said, his voice hard and clear. I am a security specialist. Your lives are in danger, but not from me. He shoved Captain Evans forward, making him stumble. This man is not who he seems. He and members of his crew are part of a criminal organization. They are using this aircraft as part of a hostile operation. He let that sink in, watching the mixture of fear and disbelief on the faces of the passengers. He needed to give them a focal point for their fear, a villain they could see. His eyes scanned the cabin and locked on Julian Croft. The businessman had remained preternaturally calm through the entire violent exchange, his expression one of intense analytical detachment. He was not a bystander. He was a spectator at his own theater. Elias pointed his finger in indictment. He is one of them, the man in the expensive suit. He is the reason they tried to kill me. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and shocking. 100 phone cameras swiveled from Elias to focus on Croft. The businessman's calm finally broke. A flicker of pure, unadulterated fury crossed his face before he smoothed it back into a mask of outraged innocence. This is absurd, Croft declared, his voice booming through the cabin. This man is clearly a lunatic, a hijacker. Captain, are you all right? But the narrative was already slipping from their grasp. The passengers had seen the crew's unprovoked aggression. They had seen the brutal, efficient way Elias had defended himself. They saw the downed flight attendants, and the captain, pale and sweating, held in a vice-like grip. He's the hijacker, Maya shouted from her seat. You tried to drag him into the cockpit. We all saw it. A murmur of agreement rippled through the passengers. The seeds of doubt had been sown. Elias looked at Dr. Eris Thorne, who was still seated, looking regretful about his clumsy accident. Their eyes met, and for the first time Eris gave him a small, conspiratorial smile. An alliance had been forged in the crucible of violence. The cabin of Flight 447 was no longer just an aircraft. It was a battleground, a courtroom, and a television studio all rolled into one. The passengers were no longer just travelers. They were witnesses, jurors, and a potential army. And Elias Vance, the ghost who wanted only to remain in the shadows, was now standing in the full, unforgiving glare of the spotlight, the reluctant leader of a rebellion at 37,000 feet. The accusation echoed in the stunned silence of the cabin. 100 pairs of eyes, 100 tiny phone lenses swiveled from Elias to Julian Croft. The businessman who had navigated the violent chaos with the detached air of a king watching a peasant brawl was suddenly thrust onto the stage. For a heartbeat, his mask of sophisticated composure cracked, revealing a flash of incandescent rage in his eyes. It was the fury of a predator, whose camouflage had been unexpectedly stripped away. He recovered instantly, summoning a wave of theatrical outrage. This is madness. Croft's voice, rich and resonant, boomed through the aircraft. He stood up, smoothing his immaculate suit jacket, the very picture of an aggrieved executive. This man is a violent psychopath. He has assaulted the flight crew, and now he's creating these wild fantasies to justify his actions. He is the hijacker. The passengers, a volatile sea of fear and confusion, wavered. Croft was believable. He looked the part. He was one of them, a member of the first-class elite. Elias was an outsider, a ghost in a hoodie who had just dispatched 2 men with brutal, terrifying efficiency. He's lying. Maya's voice cut through the uncertainty from the economy section. We all saw what happened. They tried to drag him away first. A man in a business suit near the front stood up. I don't know what's going on, but the young lady is right. The crew were the aggressors. The consensus was shifting, a fragile tide of public opinion turning against the crew. Elias still had Captain Evans pinned, his arm twisted high behind his back. The captain's face was slick with sweat, his eyes darting around seeking an escape that didn't exist. He had lost control of the cabin. His authority was gone. Elias knew this was the critical moment. He needed to secure the cockpit. The captain's keycard, he said, his voice a low command in Evans's ear. "Give it to me. Now." A strange, triumphant smirk flickered across the captain's face. "You're too late," he hissed, his voice thick with malice. In a move Elias didn't see Evans's free hand. The one not being held subtly twisted the bezel of his expensive pilot's watch. It wasn't a distress signal. It was a command. Thump, click. The sound was heavy, final, and absolute. The reinforced cockpit door, which had been left slightly ajar, slammed shut. A series of internal deadbolts shot home with the percussive finality of a prison gate. The cockpit was now a fortress sealed from the inside. Before Elias could even process the tactical setback, the PA system crackled to life. It was Captain Evans's voice, but it was wrong. It was too clear, too loud, and filled with a synthetic panic that Elias immediately recognized as a recording. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Atlantic Airways Flight 447 declaring an emergency. The aircraft has been hijacked by a passenger, David Peterson. He is armed, violent, and extremely dangerous. Repeat, we are under hostile control in the cabin. I am initiating lockdown protocols and diverting the aircraft. Mayday." The message was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. It was a lie broadcast with the full authority of the captain's office. To air traffic control, to the authorities on the ground, to the world that was undoubtedly now watching Maya's livestream, Elias Vance had just been officially branded a terrorist. As if to punctuate the announcement, the aircraft began to move. A long, sickening, deliberate bank to the left. The gentle hum of the engines changed pitch as the co-pilot, now in sole command, pushed the throttles forward. They were accelerating, and they were turning off course. On the large bulkhead monitor at the front of the cabin, the flight path map to Chicago flickered, scrambled, and went dark. They were flying blind to a destination known only to the criminals in the cockpit. Captain Evans sagged in Elias's grip, the fight gone out of him, replaced by a smug certainty. "It's over, Vance, or whoever you are." He snarled the use of Elias's real name, a final taunting admission. "My co-pilot has the stick. We're heading to a private airfield where our friends are waiting for you. You have nowhere to go." The recorded message and the sudden change in course had their intended effect on the passengers. The fragile alliance with Elias shattered. Fear, raw and primal, took over. A woman began to sob. Another passenger was shouting hysterically. The label, hijacker, was a potent poison, and it was working. And it was... Elias knew he had seconds to reverse the narrative, or he would be facing a panicked mob. He made a split-second decision. The captain was now useless as a hostage. He was just a mouthpiece. Elias shoved him hard, sending him sprawling to the floor at the feet of the other passengers. He then turned to face the cabin, raising his hand slowly in a gesture of peace. The ghost was gone, replaced by the commander. "Listen to me," his voice boomed, cutting through the rising panic. That was a pre-recorded message. "It's a trick. Can't you see? They are the hijackers. They've locked themselves in the cockpit. They have sealed you in here with their accomplices. You are all hostages." Dr. Eris Thorne, who had retrieved his cane, stood up, his academic stoicism, a calming anchor in the storm of emotion. "He is telling the truth," Eris announced, his voice carrying the weight of scholarly authority. "I am a professor of geopolitical history at Oxford. I have studied such operations. This is a classic hijack from within. They create a phantom threat to conceal their true objective. But it was Croft's turn to act. Seeing his plan unraveling, seeing the last vestiges of his control slipping away, he did what all cornered predators do. He escalated. "Enough!" he roared. He moved with a speed that was terrifying, a blur of bespoke fabric and controlled violence. He kicked the downed body of the unconscious Ben out of his way, his hand darting down to his ankle. When it came back up, it was holding a gun. It was not a standard pistol. It was a flat, matte gray ceramic firearm, a ghost gun designed to be nearly invisible to metal detectors. It was the weapon of a professional assassin. The sight of the gun sent a new wave of terror through the cabin. Screams erupted, no longer panicked but sharp with immediate mortal fear. Passengers scrambled back, tripping over each other, trying to melt into their seats. Elias started to move toward him, his body low, but Croft was too fast. He wasn't targeting Elias. He was targeting the biggest threat to his narrative, the man who had just lent Elias his credibility. He lunged for Dr. Eris Thorne. Eris tried to bring his cane up to defend himself, but Croft was younger, stronger, faster. He batted the cane away, grabbed the old professor by his tweed jacket and hauled him from his seat. He spun Eris around, locking his arm around the old man's throat and pressing the muzzle of the ceramic pistol hard against his temple. "Everybody back!" Croft screamed, his voice a raw, ragged tear in the fabric of the cabin. His eyes were wild, the mask of the calm businessman completely gone, revealing the feral killer beneath. "Nobody moves. Not another sound, or I'll paint the bulkhead with this old man's brains." The cabin froze. The chaos was replaced by a silence that was even more terrifying. The only sound was the drone of the engines carrying them all to an unknown fate. Elias stood in the middle of the aisle, unarmed, his path to Croft blocked by a wall of cowering, terrified passengers. Eris was pale, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but his eyes when they met Elias's over Croft's arm were not filled with fear. They were filled with a defiant, analytical calm. It was the look of a chess master, who even with his king in check was still calculating the next 3 moves. The horrifying truth of their situation finally settled on every passenger. They were trapped. The cockpit was controlled by criminals flying them to God knows where. A ruthless gunman was holding a helpless old man hostage in the cabin, and their only hope was the mysterious, violent man in the gray hoodie, a man who was now completely and utterly outmatched. The battle for Flight 447 had just become a hostage crisis. The world aboard Flight 447 had shrunk to the 10-foot space between Elias and Julian Croft. The air was thin, stripped of oxygen by the collective held breath of 100 passengers. The drone of the engines was a distant, irrelevant hum. All that mattered was the man with the gun, the old man in his grasp, and the ghost who stood between them. Elias did not move. Any sudden action, any hint of aggression would get Eris killed. The narrow aisle, crowded with the legs and feet of cowering passengers, was a death trap, a perfect kill zone. Croft held all the physical advantages, so Elias discarded the physical. This battle would not be won with fists or elbows. It would be fought in the landscape of the mind. He raised his hands slowly, palms open, a universal gesture of non-aggression. His movements were calm, deliberate, a stark contrast to Croft's ragged, adrenaline-fueled tension. "Let him go," Croft Elias said. His voice was not a command nor a plea. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered with an unnerving conversational calm. "Killing a hostage changes the game. Right now you're just a man with a gun. Pull that trigger and you're a murderer. There's no coming back from that. It doesn't help your situation." Croft laughed, a harsh, brittle bark devoid of humor. "My situation?" He sneered, pressing the muzzle of the ceramic pistol harder against Eris's temple. The old professor winced but remained silent. His eyes locked on Elias. "You have no idea what my situation is. You have no idea what's at stake here." This was the opening, the crack in the armor of his rage. An arrogant man always assumes his secrets are inviolable. "Oh, I think I do," Elias replied, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more intimate, as if sharing a secret between them. "I know all about Project Tartarus, the plan to turn the World Bank servers into a house of cards. It's ambitious, I'll give you that. Brilliantly conceived. Did you come up with it all by yourself, Julian? Or did the alchemist just hand you the playbook and tell you where to sign?" The names hit Croft like a physical blow. Project Tartarus, the alchemist. They were the 2 most closely guarded secrets of his entire existence. To hear them spoken aloud by this stranger in a hoodie in the middle of a commercial airliner was like listening to a madman recite the precise coordinates of his soul. Croft's face went slack with shock, his jaw tightening as his mind struggled to comprehend the impossible. The gun in his hand wavered for a fraction of a second. "How?" he whispered, the single word raspy with disbelief. "That's the question, isn't it?" Elias said, taking a slow, deliberate half-step forward. How could a nobody in a gray sweatshirt know the name of a ghost and his magnum opus? It's almost as if the ghost isn't as careful as he thinks he is. Or maybe he just doesn't care if his assets are compromised. While the psychological duel held the cabin in thrall, a different kind of battle was being fought in the relative obscurity of seat 14C. Maya, shielded by the high back of the seat in front of her, had her face illuminated by the glow of her laptop. The live stream was still running propped up on her tray table, but her focus was elsewhere. Her fingers were a blur across the keyboard, the screen a waterfall of cascading green text against a black background. She was not a casual user of technology. She was a native. She had been navigating digital backdoors since she was old enough to read. The crew had killed the public Wi-Fi, a standard move in a lockdown. But Maya knew that a modern airliner was a flying network of interconnected systems. The in-flight entertainment, the cabin lighting, the climate control, they all talked to each other. And where systems talked, there were vulnerabilities. She had found one. A diagnostic port in the entertainment system's source code, likely left behind by a lazy developer. It was a tiny crack, but it was enough. She was in. Now came the hard part, navigating the plane's internal LAN, bypassing the crew's firewalls, and finding a way to piggyback a signal out on the aircraft's own satellite, uplink a channel reserved for flight data and engine diagnostics. It was the digital equivalent of climbing out onto the wing of a plane in mid-flight to attach a letter to the tail fin. But her face was a mask of grim determination. She was fighting her war one line of code at a time. In the first-class cabin, Elias pressed his advantage, his words the carefully chosen tools of a psychological surgeon. "Does he even tell you his name?" Elias continued, his tone sympathetic, as if he and Croft were colleagues bemoaning a difficult boss. "Or are you just the asset, just another tool to be used and discarded? Let me tell you a story, Julian, about a man named Roman Kovic. He ran the Alchemist's entire Eastern European network. For 5 years he was the Ghost's right hand. But when a deal went bad in Prague, did the Alchemist pull him out? No. He sold Roman's location, his family's address, everything to a rival syndicate. They say the rival paid him with a single untraceable Bitcoin. He traded his most loyal lieutenant for pocket change and the convenience of not having to clean up a mess." Croft's face was pale. "You're lying." "Am I?" Elias asked. "Ask yourself, what's your exit plan? What happens after you land this plane? Does he meet you at the airfield, or does he just send a cleanup crew to erase the evidence? And Julian, you and everyone on this plane are the evidence." He saw his words hitting their mark. Croft's desperate rage was being diluted by a new, more terrifying emotion: doubt. Standing frozen near the galley, Laura felt Elias's words worm their way into her own carefully constructed reality. She remembered her own briefing, the secrecy, the compartmentalization, the promise of a life-changing payout for a simple one-time job. She had been told the plan was foolproof. But now Marco and Ben were unconscious, possibly seriously injured on the floor. Captain Evans was a defeated, blubbering mess being watched over by a burly passenger Elias had deputized. And Croft, their calm, confident leader, was holding a gun to an old man's head, his face a mask of sweat and panic. This was not foolproof. This was a catastrophe. He burns everything he touches. Elias's words echoed in her mind. She thought of the money she had been promised, money to get her sick mother into a private care facility. She had justified her actions with that noble goal. But now she saw the truth. She was not a key player in a grand scheme. She was a single disposable gear in a machine, and the machine was breaking down around her. When it was over, she would not be a wealthy woman. She would be a loose end, a witness, a liability to be erased. Elias delivered his final verbal blow. "He promised you a fortune, didn't he, Julian? A seat at the table. A life of quiet luxury after this one last job." He gestured around the cabin with one of his raised hands. "Look around you. Look at all these phones broadcasting your face to the world. The authorities already know your name, your history, your offshore accounts. This mission is over. It failed the moment I refused to leave my seat." He let the silence hang for a moment, then drove the point home. The Alchemist is already gone. He's probably watching this same live stream from a penthouse in Dubai, and he's already activating his exit strategy. A strategy that involves erasing every link back to him. You are the first and most important link. Is taking the fall for a man who sees you as nothing more than a liability, worth the price of that old man's life. Croft's entire body was trembling now, his face a canvas of warring emotions. The rage that had sustained him was gone, replaced by the cold, creeping terror of betrayal. The seed of doubt Elias had planted had taken root, and it was choking him. The gun in his hand, once an instrument of power, now felt impossibly heavy. The standoff had reached its breaking point. The physical confrontation had ended, but the psychological war was at its peak. Croft's will was fracturing. In the back, Maya's fingers flew faster, a final string of code scrolling across her screen as she bypassed the last firewall. And near the galley, Laura's hand moved slowly, deliberately toward the emergency intercom phone on the wall. The battle for Julian Croft's soul was about to determine the fate of everyone on Flight 447. The invisible thread of tension holding the cabin in a state of suspended terror was stretched to its breaking point. Julian Croft stood trembling, a man balanced on the knife edge of his own ruin. Elias's words had been a solvent dissolving the foundations of Croft's fanatical resolve, leaving behind a quivering mass of fear and doubt. He wouldn't. Croft whispered the words a desperate prayer. He wasn't speaking to Elias anymore. He was trying to convince himself. He wouldn't sacrifice me. Wouldn't he? Elias pressed his voice a cold scalpel of logic. He's a ghost, Julian. A phantom in the machine. Ghosts don't have partners or allies. They only have victims and loose ends. And right now, you're the loosest end in the world. At that precise moment, the fragile stalemate shattered not from the front but from the side. Laura, who had been a statue of terrified indecision by the galley, made her choice. Her loyalty to her own survival, to her own conscience, finally eclipsed her fear of the alchemist. Her hand, shaking but resolute, snatched the emergency crew intercom from its cradle on the wall. She pressed the button to talk to the cockpit. "Co-pilot Jensen, this is Flight Attendant Mitchell," she said, her voice a strained but clear transmission of betrayal. "Listen to me carefully. Captain Evans has lied to you. The cabin is not under the control of a hijacker. We are under the control of a hostile passenger, Julian Croft, in Seat 2C. He is armed and holding a hostage. I repeat, Croft is the threat. We need help. Please respond." Hearing his name, hearing the undeniable sound of Laura's betrayal broadcast to the one man who could still save him, was the final catalyst for Croft's sanity to snap. The doubt and fear vaporized, replaced by a volcanic nihilistic rage. He was being erased, just as Elias had said. If he was going down, he would pull the whole world down with him. He let out a raw, animalistic scream and turned his body pivoting with deadly intent, bringing the ceramic pistol around to point directly at Laura. He was going to execute the traitor, but he had forgotten about the old man in his arms. In the split second that Croft's attention was diverted, Dr. Eris Thorne acted. He was no longer a frail academic. His body moved with the coiled, efficient power of a man who knew violence intimately. He drove the heel of his leather shoe down with crushing force onto Croft's instep, eliciting a sharp gasp of pain. Simultaneously, he threw his head backward, a short, vicious arc that smashed the back of his skull directly into the bridge of Croft's nose. There was a wet crunching sound. Croft's head snapped back. Crack. The gun went off. The sound in the enclosed fuselage was deafening, a physical blow that vibrated through the floor. Passengers screamed, diving for cover hands over their ears. The bullet, fired blindly, tore a jagged hole in a ceiling panel, severing a bundle of wires and causing a section of the cabin lights to flicker and die, plunging them into a terrifying twilight. Eris used the moment of shock to shove himself away from his captor, stumbling back into Elias's arms. Croft staggered, momentarily blinded, a gout of blood erupting from his shattered nose. The hostage was free. The cabin had descended into pure, untamed chaos. Elias pushed Eris behind him, shielding the older man. The immediate threat from Croft was momentarily neutralized, but the larger, more critical problem remained the sealed cockpit. The co-pilot Jensen had just received two wildly conflicting reports. He would be confused, terrified, and would trust no one. He would follow his last orders, fly to the private airfield. They were still hurtling toward a trap. "We have to get in that cockpit," Elias said, his voice a sharp, urgent command that cut through the noise. He pulled his new, unlikely allies into a tight, impromptu huddle. Eris, his face pale but his eyes blazing with adrenaline. Laura looking terrified by her own bravery. And Maya, who had abandoned her seat and rushed forward, her laptop clutched to her chest like a shield. "Can you talk to him?" Elias asked Maya, pointing toward the cockpit. "Can you get past his firewalls? Tell him what's really happening." "No way," Maya said, shaking her head, her pink hair flying. "The intercom is one way from this end except for the crew phones, and he'll never trust Laura now. He'll think it's a trick. Digitally, he's locked me out of the comm system completely. I can see the network, but I can't talk on it. We're deaf and dumb." A grim finality settled on Elias's face. Then we're going in. He looked at the cockpit door. It was a slab of reinforced alloy and composite materials designed to stop a grenade. But every fortress has a weakness. I need a diversion. He set his mind racing, assembling a plan from the wreckage of their situation. A big one. Something that will draw the co-pilot's attention to the rear of the aircraft. He looked around, and his eyes landed on the burly passenger from business class who had stood up for him earlier. You, Elias pointed. I need your help. The man nodded, his face grim. What do you need? Go to the rear galley. Take 2 or 3 others with you. Start a fire. A small one contained. Use a metal waste bin. I don't want flames. I want smoke. Thick, black smoke. It will trigger the smoke alarms in the aft cabin. That will light up the co-pilot's sensor panel for the rear of the plane. He'll be distracted trying to figure out if it's a fire or an electrical short. It'll buy us time. The passenger didn't hesitate. He grabbed 2 other able-bodied men and they scrambled down the aisle, a volunteer fire brigade on a mission. Elias turned his attention back to the door. The door itself is impenetrable. He explained to Eris and Laura, his voice low and quick. But the locking mechanism is electronic. It's controlled by a digital keypad and a solenoid bolt. If we can overload the circuitry with a powerful directed electrical charge, we might be able to fry the mechanism and force the bolt to retract. With what Laura asked, her eyes wide. We don't have explosives. We don't need them, Elias said. His gaze fell upon the overturned service cart. He saw the small, powerful lithium-ion battery packs from the handheld credit card scanners now scattered across the floor. He saw a row of unbroken high-proof gin and vodka miniatures. An idea born of desperation and a half-remembered lesson from his agency's demolitions expert sparked in his mind. We'll make our own. While Elias began to salvage the components he needed, Croft roared back to life. His face was a horrifying mask of blood, his suit ruined. He was no longer a sophisticated executive. He was a wounded animal driven by pure, murderous rage. He surged forward, not toward Elias, but toward the nearest passengers, grabbing a terrified young woman and pulling her in front of him as a shield. The passengers who had volunteered for the fire crew, seeing the renewed threat, turned back. The burly man met Croft's charge with a roar of his own, tackling him around the waist. A brutal, chaotic brawl erupted in the aisle, a desperate struggle of ordinary people fighting a trained killer. From the rear of the plane, a thin tendril of gray smoke snaked along the ceiling, followed by another and another. A high-pitched, piercing alarm began to chime from the aft cabin. The diversion had begun. Help me with this, Elias commanded Laura and Eris. They worked with frantic precision, shielded from the brawl by the galley wall. Elias stripped the wires from the battery packs with his teeth. Eris emptied the gin and vodka onto a pile of cloth napkins, creating a highly flammable, conductive poultice. Laura, using her knowledge of the cart's contents, found a roll of heavy-duty foil tape. They packed the saturated napkins into an empty metal water pitcher, embedding the stripped wires from the batteries deep inside the cloth. Elias then sealed the top with the foil tape, creating a crude makeshift capacitor, a directed energy device. It was wildly unstable and just as likely to explode in his hands as it was to work. He held the finished device. It was heavy humming with barely contained power. This will create a massive electrical surge, he said, his voice tight. When I place it, you need to get back, as far as you can. The brawl in the aisle was reaching a bloody crescendo. Croft was fighting with inhuman ferocity, but the passengers were fueled by adrenaline and the desperate courage of the doomed. They were holding him at a terrible cost. It's now or never, Eris said, his breath ragged. Elias nodded. He took a deep breath, broke from the cover of the galley, and ran the few feet to the cockpit door. He slammed the metal pitcher against the door directly over the electronic keypad for the lock. The foil tape held it in place. The 2 bare wires leading from the battery pack sparked ominously. "Get back!" he screamed to Eris and Laura. To the brawling passengers, he yelled, "Get down!" He took the 2 sparking wires in his hand. The brawl paused for a second, all eyes turning to him. Smoke was now thick in the cabin. The alarm was a maddening shriek. In the cockpit, the co-pilot would be staring at a board full of flashing red lights. Elias looked at the wires, then at the door. The final assault was about to begin. The world was smoke fear and the piercing shriek of the aft smoke alarm. Elias stood before the cockpit door, a makeshift electrical bomb in one hand, the fate of all 157 souls aboard the aircraft in the other. Behind him, the chaotic brawl against Julian Croft raged on a desperate, grunting struggle between ordinary people and a cornered killer. Every instinct in Elias's battle-honed body screamed at him to join the fight to end the threat of Croft for good. But he knew the true battle lay beyond the steel door in front of him. The co-pilot Jensen was the head of the snake. As long as he was in control, they were all just cargo being flown to their own slaughter. There was no more time for calculation. "Get down," he roared one last time. He touched the two bare wires together. The result was not a fiery explosion, but something far more elemental. A silent, blinding flash of pure white light, as if a miniature sun had been born and died in the space of a microsecond. It was followed by a deafening crack, the sound of air being ripped apart by unrestrained voltage. A shower of incandescent blue and orange sparks erupted from the door's keypad, which melted into a slag of blackened plastic. The acrid smell of ozone, sharp and sterile, flooded the cabin, momentarily overwhelming the smell of the smoke. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The door remained shut, a silent monument to his failure. Then, with a low hydraulic groan of protesting metal, the heavy solenoid deadbolt, its circuits fried and its magnetic lock shattered, retracted into the doorframe. It was open. Elias didn't hesitate. He dropped the now useless device and threw his shoulder into the heavy reinforced door. It swung inward, revealing the inner sanctum. The cockpit was a cave of technological twilight, the daytime glare blocked by the pilot's sunscreens. The only light came from the chaotic galaxy of the instrument panels, which were blinking with a dizzying array of red and yellow warnings from the smoke alarm and the depressurized cabin door. And in the center of it all stood the co-pilot. Jensen was younger than Elias had expected, barely 30, his face pale and slick with the sweat of pure terror. He had clearly heard the commotion, heard Laura's betrayal over the intercom, and had been expecting something to happen. In his hands, he gripped the cockpit's emergency fire axe, its red paint gleaming malevolently in the flashing lights. He had been preparing for a fire. He was not prepared for a ghost. For a frozen moment, the two men stared at each other. Then Jensen let out a high, terrified scream and charged, swinging the axe in a wild, clumsy arc. Elias dove low under the swing. The heavy axe head whistled through the air where his head had just been, and embedded itself with a sickening thud in the composite material of the bulkhead just behind the captain's seat. The fight was a brutal, claustrophobic nightmare. There was no room for technique, no space for maneuver. It was a primal struggle for dominance in a space no bigger than a closet surrounded by the most complex and delicate machinery on the planet. Elias drove his shoulder into Jensen's stomach, forcing him back. Jensen brought his knee up, catching Elias in the ribs. They crashed against the central console, their bodies accidentally flicking switches and turning dials. Then Jensen's flailing body slammed hard against the captain's control yoke, pushing it violently forward. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The nose of the 737 pitched downward. The gentle drone of the engines became a high-pitched scream of protest. A gut-wrenching negative G-force filled the cabin, lifting unsecured objects and people off the floor. A new, far more terrifying alarm began to blare, a synthetic female voice repeating a single horrifying word. Stall, stall, stall. The aircraft was falling out of the sky. In the cabin, the brawl with Croft ended instantly. Physics had become the new enemy. Bodies were thrown against the ceiling, then slammed back down onto seats and armrests as the dive steepened. The world became a vertical nightmare of screams and tumbling debris. In the cockpit, Elias realized the fight for his life had become a fight for everyone's life. He ignored the blows Jensen was raining down on his back and focused on a single objective. He hooked his leg around Jensen's and twisted, using the co-pilot's own weight to send them both crashing to the floor, wedged between the seats. He transitioned, immediately locking his arm around Jensen's neck in a carotid restraint, cutting off the flow of blood to his brain. Jensen struggled, his hands clawing at Elias's arm, but it was too late. After 5 desperate seconds, he went limp, unconscious. Elias shoved the co-pilot's dead weight aside and scrambled into the captain's seat, his heart pounding against his ribs. The scene through the cockpit window was a vision of impending doom. The blue sky was gone, replaced by the terrifying, fast-approaching brown and green of the earth. The control yoke was shaking so violently it was a blur. The airspeed indicator was deep in the red. The synthesized voice was a constant screaming mantra. Pull up, sink rate, pull up. He grabbed the yoke with both hands. It fought him like a living beast. His mind, a maelstrom of adrenaline a moment before, became preternaturally calm. He drew on a past he had thought was buried forever on long nights flying C-130s in and out of hot zones, the muscle memory still there deep in his bones. "Come on, baby," he whispered, his voice a raw prayer. He planted his feet, using all his strength to pull back on the yoke. The G-forces were crushing, pushing him deep into his seat, trying to drain the blood from his head. He fought it, gritting his teeth, his vision tunneling. He disengaged the frantic, malfunctioning autopilot and pushed the throttles to their maximum, demanding every ounce of power the engines could give. Slowly, agonizingly, the nose began to lift. The scream of the wind over the wings began to lessen. The groaning of the airframe, stressed to its absolute limit, was the sound of tortured metal. For a terrifying 10 seconds, he didn't know if the wings would hold. Then the stall warning fell silent. The artificial horizon on the main display leveled out. The terrifying proximity alarms ceased their screaming. He was flying, level and stable. They were alive. He let out a breath. He didn't realize he had been holding his body drenched in sweat, every muscle screaming in protest. Back in the cabin, a stunned, bruised, and disoriented collection of passengers began to pick themselves up from the floor. The violent dive had ended the fight with Croft decisively. The gunman was now dazed and pinned under the body of the burly passenger, who, despite a broken arm, had refused to let go. Belts and torn strips of first-class curtain were quickly used to bind Croft's hands and feet. He was neutralized. Elias took the radio headset, his hands still shaking. He pressed the transmit button. "Mayday! Mayday, mayday! Atlantic Flight 447, he said, his voice ragged. "This is a passenger in command of the aircraft. The designated flight crew has been incapacitated. We have sustained damage to the aircraft and have multiple injuries on board. Requesting immediate vectors to the nearest suitable airport for an emergency landing." There was a stunned silence on the other end. Then a calm, professional voice came back. "Atlantic 447. We copy your mayday. We are showing you far off your designated course. Can you state your intentions?" "My intention is to land this plane," Elias said. "Now." Maya, her face bruised but her eyes bright, appeared at the cockpit door. "I have a stable link. I can feed our exact GPS coordinates to them from my laptop. They'll be able to guide you in." With Maya relaying precise information and air traffic control providing calm, steady instructions, the path to safety began to clear. But Elias had one last piece of business. He needed to know. He dragged the semi-conscious Captain Evans, who had been secured by passengers during the dive, to the cockpit door. He held the man up by his collar. "It's over, Evans." Elias said, his voice a low, cold whisper of finality. "Croft is tied up. Your co-pilot is dreaming. You are going to spend the rest of your life in a cage. But you have one chance right now to make it a slightly more comfortable one. The Alchemist. Where was the real destination? Where was he meeting you?" Evans looked at Elias, his eyes filled with a mixture of pure hatred and the hollow emptiness of a man who knows he has been betrayed and abandoned. He coughed, a bloody smear on his lips. "There was no meeting," he spat. "We were never meant to see him. We were just the delivery service. All communications were routed through a dead drop server. But the money, the final payment, it was to be released from an account at the FIM Bank in Valletta. He sagged, the last of his fight gone. Malta. The final transfer was coming from Malta. That's all I know, I swear. Malta." The name resonated in Elias's mind. A haven for offshore banking and shadowy corporations. A perfect place for a ghost to launder his money. He had it. The final thread. The end of the trail. He dropped Evans to the floor and returned to the pilot's seat. He looked out the windscreen. Through a break in the clouds below, he could see them, the bright, welcoming, beautiful lights of an airport runway laid out like a promise. He had saved the plane. He had the data from the chip. And now he had a name. A place. The end was finally in sight. The runway lights of O'Hare International Airport rushed up to meet them, a brilliant, orderly river of white and red in the pre-dawn darkness. In the cockpit, the atmosphere was one of intensely focused calm. Elias's hands were steady on the controls, his movements economical and precise as he guided the wounded behemoth through its final descent. Beside him, Maya relayed the calm, steady instructions of the air traffic controller, her voice a lifeline to the world below. "Altitude 500 feet, she reported, her eyes glued to the instruments. "Wind is 3 knots from the west. You are cleared for landing on runway 27 left. Cleared to land, Elias confirmed his own eyes scanning the horizon, the yoke, the airspeed indicator. He was no longer a ghost or a hunter. He was a pilot with 156 lives in his hands. The landing was not gentle. The damaged landing gear screamed in protest as the tires made contact with the tarmac. The aircraft shuddered violently, and for a terrifying moment, Elias fought to keep the wings level as it fishtailed on the runway. He engaged the reverse thrusters, and the roar was a deafening final cry of defiance. The plane slowed, stabilized, and finally rolled to a stop. For a long moment, the only sound in the entire aircraft was the whine of the engines powering down and the frantic, joyful sobbing of a passenger in the back. Then the cabin erupted. A wave of applause, cheers, and hysterical, relieved laughter washed over them. It was the sound of people who had stared into the abyss and been pulled back at the last possible second. Outside, the darkness was banished by a sea of flashing lights. A fleet of fire trucks, ambulances, and police cruisers surrounded the aircraft, their beams cutting through the smoke still trickling from the emergency exits. Among them were the sleek black SUVs of the federal government. The authorities had arrived. This was his exit cue. As emergency crews swarmed the plane, popping open the main doors and raising ladders to the exits, chaos became his camouflage. Medics and law enforcement officers flooded the cabin. Elias was no longer the pilot. He was just another passenger, another face in the crowd. He knew he had to vanish before the official debriefings began, before his face was photographed, and his false name, David Peterson, was entered into a dozen government databases. He slipped out of the captain's seat. He turned to his small, battered team of allies. He placed a hand on Aris's shoulder. The old professor was leaning heavily on his cane, looking exhausted but exhilarated. "Thank you, Professor Elias," said, his voice filled with a genuine warmth that had been absent for 5 long years. Aris smiled, his eyes twinkling behind his spectacles. "The pleasure was all mine, my boy. As a historian, I must say it is far more stimulating to live history than to simply read about it. Do try to stay out of trouble." Elias then looked at Maya. She was already being hailed as a hero by the passengers, the girl who had shown the world the truth. "You saved us all, Maya," he said. She just grinned, a flash of youthful, irrepressible spirit. "Just another Tuesday," she quipped. "You take care of yourself, Ghost Man." A silent understanding passed between them. They would never speak of this again, but the bond forged in the crucible of Flight 447 would remain. As Elias made his way toward the chaos of the emergency slide, he saw a single figure detach himself from the swarm of dark-suited FBI agents on the tarmac. He was an older man in a simple gray suit that didn't quite fit his face, etched with the weariness of 1,000 secrets. It was his old contact Henderson, a man from a life he had supposedly left behind. Elias met him at the bottom of the slide, away from the main crush of people. No names were exchanged. None were needed. Elias pulled the hardened smartphone from his pocket and pressed it into Henderson's hand. "Project Tartarus." Elias said, his voice low. "The target is the World Bank. The trigger to disarm the virus and the key to the Alchemist's entire financial network is on this phone. Everything you need to unravel him is there." Henderson pocketed the phone, his tired eyes holding a flicker of awe. "We've been chasing this phantom for a decade. The whole agency couldn't find him." "They weren't motivated enough," Elias replied, a shadow of Anya passing through his thoughts. "And you?" Henderson asked. "We can offer you protection. A new identity." Elias shook his head. "I have one last loose end to tie up. After that, I'm gone for good." He gave Henderson a final nod, turned, and melted into the swirling chaos of the airfield. He walked past the flashing lights and the shouting officials, just another survivor wrapped in a blanket. His face obscured his identity, dissolving back into the shadows. Elias Vance was gone. The ghost had vanished. 4 weeks later, Valletta, Malta. The ancient city was carved from limestone the color of honey, baked by a relentless Mediterranean sun. Elias Vance was a different man now. The hoodie and the haunted look were gone, replaced by a lightweight linen shirt and the easy, anonymous confidence of a tourist. He was clean-shaven, his hair cut short, his movements relaxed. He was no longer hiding. He was hunting. The information from Captain Evans was the thread, and Elias had pulled it. While the world's intelligence agencies, armed with the data from the phone, began the slow, monumental task of dismantling the Alchemist's digital empire, Elias was moving faster, using the more ancient tools of the trade, following the money. The Fimbank in Valletta was a dead end, a shell corporation. but it had led him on a trail of transactions to a bank in Cyprus and then to a broker in Sicily. The trail ended here at a magnificent isolated villa perched on a cliffside overlooking the Azure Sea just outside the Sicilian town of Taormina. It was a fortress of modernist glass and white stone surrounded by ancient olive groves. He breached the villa's high-tech security after midnight, moving through the infrared sensors and pressure plates with a phantom's grace. He found him in a vast minimalist office, the entire seaward wall a single sheet of glass, the stormy night sky his backdrop. He was not what Elias had expected. The alchemist was a man of medium height and build in his late 50s with graying hair and the soft, unassuming face of a university librarian. He was dressed in a simple cashmere sweater, standing by the window watching the lightning flash far out at sea. He didn't seem surprised. He didn't even turn around. Elias Vance. The alchemist said, his voice calm-cultured. "I confess I wondered if you would make it this far. I watched the live stream of your flight. It was quite entertaining. You have a flair for the dramatic." "I'm here for Anya," Elias said, his voice flat, devoid of the emotion that had burned in him for so long. The alchemist finally turned a faint, pitying smile on his face. "Ah, yes. The wife. A casualty of commerce, I'm afraid. Her death, your team's death. It was never personal. It was simply a transaction. I had a client who paid for a piece of information. I provided it. What they did with it was their business, not mine." He spread his hands, a gesture of absolute sociopathic detachment. He expected a lunge, a gunshot, the violent retribution he had seen in 1,000 lesser men. He expected the warrior's way. But Elias looked at the man before him and saw nothing. Not a mythic villain, not a criminal mastermind, but a hollow man, an accountant of chaos, who profited from misery, but felt nothing. Vengeance would be a waste of emotion. Killing him wouldn't bring Anya back. It wouldn't heal the wound in his soul. It would only make him a murderer chained to this man's ghost for the rest of his life. "Killing you is too easy," Elias said, his voice quiet. "Your power, your entire identity is built on being a ghost. Your real prison isn't a cell. It's being known. It's having your name, your face, and every dirty secret you ever brokered laid bare for the world to see." A flicker of confusion, then alarm appeared in the alchemist's calm eyes. "As we speak," Elias continued, "every intelligence agency from Langley to London is executing warrants based on the data you so foolishly put on that chip. They are seizing your accounts, arresting your assets, flipping your lieutenants. The empire is falling." As if on cue, a sound began to intrude on the quiet of the villa. A low, rhythmic whump, whump, whump that grew steadily louder. Red and blue lights flashed against the clouds, reflecting off the glass wall. 3 helicopters were descending on the villa. From the sea below, the lights of fast-moving patrol boats were converging on the cliffs. The alchemist rushed to the window, his face finally a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. It was not the fear of death. It was the fear of exposure, the fear of being named, catalogued, and forgotten in a prison file. His power was his anonymity, and Elias had stripped it away, leaving him naked to the world. Days later, Elias stood on a different cliff, this one quiet and deserted. He watched the sun rise, painting the Mediterranean in hues of orange and gold. He took a worn, faded photograph of Anya from his wallet. She was smiling, her head thrown back in laughter, the sun in her hair. He held it for a long moment, memorizing every detail one last time. He had avenged her not with a bullet, but with justice. He had finished her work. He let the photograph go. The wind caught it, carrying it out over the sea, a final fond farewell. He was not erasing her. He was letting her go. He was freeing them both. He turned his back on the sea and began to walk, not into the shadows of the past, but into the warm, welcoming light of a new dawn. His future was an unwritten page, and for the first time in a very long time, he was ready to write it. And so our story concludes. It serves as a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest battles are not fought on war-torn fields, but in the narrow confines of an airplane aisle or in the silent chambers of the human heart. It shows us that courage can be found in the most unexpected of allies, a determined student, a repentant crew member, a wise old professor. And it teaches us that true justice is not about seeking revenge, but about dismantling the systems that allow evil to flourish, ensuring that the ghosts of the past can finally find peace, allowing for a new day to begin. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. We truly appreciate you spending your time with our story. If you found it compelling, we would be honored if you'd give the video a like and perhaps consider subscribing to our channel for more tales like this one. Your support allows us to continue bringing these narratives to life. Until next time, travel safe and look out for one another.